Dirty Politics, Hard Times, a Trilogy of Chartism, narrated by the author, Malc Cowle. Book 1. The Manchester Chartist. Chapter 8. When Matthew Ethrow, Daniel Ackroyd, and Irene Rose set out from Hardwick in the Pony and Trap, they made their way through a fine drizzle along Stockport Road, through the townships of Longsight and Levenshulme, before veering off towards Parswood. By the time they crossed the River Mersey, forsaking Lancashire for Cheshire, intermittent sunshine replaced the drizzle, and they found themselves in pleasant, undulating countryside before entering the small village of Cheadle. Here they stopped at the Farmer's Arms to partake of refreshment and to give their pony a well-earned rest. Matthew was in an ebullient mood, and had taken great delight in outlining his long-term plans for rehousing his operatives. At the same time, he'd explained how he hoped to win support on the newly elected Manchester Borough Council for a campaign to tackle issues such as street planning, the provision of fresh clean water, and practical means for the disposal of refuse and sewage. Irene Rose had asked him about his contacts with the Gregg family. Matthew informed her he'd first met Samuel Gregg back in 1815, when he himself was a young man and deputy manager of his father's mill in Chorlton-upon-Medlock. In those days, Samuel Gregg had supported parliamentary reform and been influenced to a certain degree by the ideas of Robert Owen and the religious ideals of the Unitarians. Born in 1771 in mid-Wales, Owen had moved to Manchester as a young lad and soon found his feet within the rapidly growing textile industry. By 1790 he was a master cotton spinner and manager of a cotton mill in the town. Owen's instincts, his personal experiences and observations led him to believe workers responded more positively to kindness than to cruelty. Such was his influence amongst the progressive manufacturers of the town, he was elected a member of the influential Literary and Philosophical Society in 1793. As a result, his ideas on social reform and the importance of education, particularly for the young, began to take shape. Samuel Gregg had opened Quarrybank Mill in 1784, and although it is unlikely he'd ever have admitted it, over subsequent years had incorporated some of Owen's ideas into the way it was run, whilst discarding others. Owen's overall attitude had been to make the interests of his employees, and particularly those of their children, paramount, while Samuel was only interested in those measures that ensured a well-run manufactory and directly contributed to high levels of profit. Robert Hyde Gregg, Samuel's eldest son, had entered the business in 1817 at the age of 22, and shortly after his father made him a partner. He became manager of the company in 1832 on his father's retirement. By 1831, Samuel Gregg and Company comprised 5 factories with some 4,000 power looms between them. Robert now managed Quarrybank, and his 3 younger brothers the rest. John Gregg managing 1 mill in Lancaster and 1 in Caton. His brother, young Samuel, managing the Bollington Mill, again on the Bollin upstream of Style, and William Gregg, the Berry Mill. All 4 brothers had become partners along with old Samuel. However, Robert received 25% of the profits, whilst his brothers only received 10% each. In total, they employed over 2,000 people, and processed £4 million weight of raw cotton into cloth every year. Indeed, in 1831, they were estimated to produce 0.6% of all the yarn and 1.03% of all the cloth produced in Britain. All the Greggs were members of the Unitarian Church, as were many of the Manchester cotton manufacturers, and this was how Matthew had first made contact with them directly. The Unitarians differed from other Christian churches in that they rejected the idea of the Holy Trinity, insisting God was a single entity, hence their name. They didn't accept the idea that Jesus of Nazareth was the Son of God, and rejected the notion of the virgin birth, regarding Jesus as a mortal man, an example to others, whose teachings were to be followed. They also supported, initially, universal suffrage. The fact so many of the Manchester manufacturers were members of the church meant it provided an extremely useful meeting place for making business contacts and securing deals, so much so that Matthew often doubted the degree to which his fellow businessmen subscribed in any genuine way to the Church's teachings. Like his father, Robert Hyde Gregg had taken a lively interest in the need for parliamentary reform. Nonetheless, once the 1832 Reform Act had been passed, ensuring his right to vote and to stand for election, he became a vigorous opponent of any further attempts to extend the franchise, and increasingly fearful of the ever-increasing growth of trade unionism amongst the working classes. With regard to the latter, he believed the only way to protect workers from their follies was to educate them, or, at least as Matthew put it, to educate them to be deferential to their alleged natural superiors, their masters, and accept their God-given subordinate role in life. By the time they'd recommenced their journey, and finally arrived at the long tree-lined drive through the fields which would take them to the mill, Irene Rose and Daniel Ackroyd knew a lot more about the Gregg family than when they started out. Irene Rose's appetite now aroused, she looked forward to gaining greater and more detailed knowledge. Bess Ackroyd! Bess, Clara and Charlotte stopped in their tracks and turned to see Lisa Hodgkinson hurrying after them. What's the matter? Bess asked. I need your advice, Bess. I've been told you're organising union at Gibraltar. We've petitioned Nathaniel West at Nelson Mill to provide guards on drive belts to no avail. Can I meet you tonight to talk about it? Why not now? Aren't they free? I suppose so. I'm off to Mary Upton's to feed Babby. Come with me, and they can share food with us. That agreed, the four women set off together, and were soon entering Mary's welcoming kitchen. Bess explained Lisa's presence, and the midwife urged her to sit down at the table, placing a bowl with bread and cheese in front of her, and encouraging her to eat what she could. Once the women had fed the older children and had their babies at their breasts, Lisa informed them another accident had only been prevented by a stroke of luck that very morning. Another woman had brushed past a moving belt, and its buckle had caught the back of her blouse as it shot upwards at high speed. Ironically, the woman's poverty had saved her life. The material of her blouse had been rotten and given way. The woman had thus escaped serious injury, although her back would have a permanent scar between her shoulder blades, where the buckle had gouged out a long chunk from her flesh. She was e'er so lucky. She'd her hair tied up in a scarf and her head were bent forward, or else Belt would have had her head off, Lisa told them. Bess informed her she expected a visit at her home that evening from a local official of the union, and she promised to take it up with him. The old-fashioned buckled drive belts at Gibraltar Mill had long since been replaced, and Bess knew the safer stitched alternatives were readily available. She asked Lisa how many of the spinners at Nelson Mill were union members, the reply being no more than 1 in 5, but 9 out of 10 were angry enough to have signed the petition. The general view was the first priority must be to win the majority to join the union, and once that had been achieved, consider how best to persuade the company to make improvements. Clara and Charlotte agreed to help convince the operatives they should join the Cotton Spinners' Union, as did Mary Upton. Once more, she said her barn and yard could be used to host any meeting. Well, I must say the mill was very impressive. Yes, father, it was. Just a little too impressive, if you ask me. Matthew eyed his daughter. Exactly how do you mean, Rose? I think we were shown exactly that which would impress us, and little of that which wouldn't. Matthew gazed at her, still wondering what she meant. Father, we were shown a beautiful building situated in lovely surroundings. We lingered by the bollard, viewed the mill dam and the mill race. Our guide suggested it made a lovely setting for a picnic in the spring and summer months. Great pains were taken to explain how they controlled the water flow, the intricacies of the water wheel, and how it powered the machinery, the lack of a mill chimney belching out sulphurous smoke, and how much the mill hands benefited from living in open countryside, miles from any town. All were drawn to our attention. Evidently everything was perfect for the workers, everything organised for their benefit. It was almost as though the production of yarn and cloth was a sideline. I wish I could provide such clean water and air for my workers, he replied. Yes, clean air for the operatives to enjoy, a large new airy weaving shed with state-of-the-art machinery and good ventilation. All well and good, father, but we spent more time outside the mill than in it, and once we were in, we spent more time in the new weaving shed than in the old spinning rooms. Every yard of our tour of inspection was very much controlled, don't you think? But the operatives seemed to be happy enough. Yes, they did. The few we were allowed to see, but when I asked to speak to one of the apprentices, I was told I mustn't distract her from her work. When I asked to see their living quarters, I was informed there was no time. The same situation applied when we visited the mill workers' cottages. It was all too well arranged. Matthew shook his head. I think you're letting your imagination run away with you in a rather negative way. You seem determined to find fault where none existed. I'm afraid when I made my excuse to leave our conducted tour of housing, I took the opportunity to make some inquiries of my own. The fact is, both cottages we were shown were those of overseers, not operatives. Furthermore, the person showing us around, who we'd been told was a weaver, was in fact an overseer. The cottages of the spinners and weavers are far smaller and not so well appointed as those we were conducting around, and they don't have gardens. Both Matthew and Daniel looked surprised. Irene Rose looked into her father's questioning eyes. I know, because I took the trouble to look, and in one I found a man of about 25. He was at home carrying out the housework. The poor fellow was darning socks whilst his wife and 2 daughters were at work. He was embarrassed when I questioned him, not because he had free time, but because he was reduced to doing housework when he believed he should be winning bread for his family. He finally confessed his unhappiness to me. He was a weaver and a proud, and I have no doubt from the way he spoke to me, a hard-working and honest man, but because of a slight downturn in trade he'd been laid off, whilst his lower-paid wife and children were kept on. He discovered the previous week his wife had been promoted and placed in charge of the power looms which he'd operated, although she wasn't paid anywhere near the same wage. She smiled and shook her head. We were being taken for fools by Robert-eyed Gregg, she assured him. Not only that, but I visited the local shop and discovered the prices of all items were at least 10% higher than I'd expect to pay. They were even selling the vegetables grown by the apprentices at above retail prices. As the nearest alternative shops are at least 5 miles distant, and operatives have no other means except to walk to them, they have little choice other than to use the local shop, which is owned by Mr. Gregg. It's an ingenious and perfectly legal variation on the truck system. She placed her hand on Matthew's arm. The fact is, father, even if we'd had the opportunity to discuss the question of wages and working conditions with the operatives, even without an overseer present, what would most of them have told us, other than their life was idyllic? The weaver I spoke to was clearly a broken man, but he never said a bad word about Gregg. It took all my wiles to convince him I wasn't a threat but a friend. Robert-eyed Gregg owns his workers body and soul. They daren't criticise him. He has the power to throw them out of employment without which they starve. He rents their houses to them and sells them their food. He makes profit by employing their labour power and then makes further profit when they spend their wages on shelter and the necessities of life. How long would a woman last who advocated union membership in the mill, or even spoke up on behalf of an apprentice she saw maltreated? How long do you think Mr. Gregg would knowingly employ a supporter of the Charter? She shook her head again. The only operatives who have a secure place with him are the parish apprentices, and then only until they're 18. He pays them no wages, and they have no redress against any injustice perpetrated against them. Are you aware they lock the apprentices up at night to prevent them running away? If things were as wonderful as the Greggs would have us believe, the children wouldn't want to run away, would they? Matthew smiled wryly. You seem to be saying we've had a wasted journey. On the contrary, father, I think there is much to learn from our visit. Although the cottages of the workers are not so large as those of the overseers, they're still a major improvement on those in Manchester. They've obviously been built to last and are reasonably well designed. After all, it's in Gregg's interest they are well built. He needs to provide housing for his workers, There's no alternative. In other words, his cottages are an asset from which he derives income, and they give him more control over his workforce. The ownership and control of the houses is the real question. If you build houses for your mill operatives, father, you mustn't then use those houses as a weapon to control your workers. I think that's immoral. A way must be found of handing over control to an independent body on which the tenants are represented, which would provide you with an agreed basic return on your original capital expenditure and ensure the tenants security of tenure and rents they can afford. Matthew nodded, realizing the implications, and admiring the way his daughter had marshalled her facts and used them to draw lessons for the future. Encouraged, Irene rose, warm to her task. If you provide a reading room, you mustn't then dictate which books can be read. If you provide education, you mustn't stop people acquiring knowledge of a subject that is of interest to them, because you might find it undesirable from your own point of view, or because it may challenge your own self-interest, as Greg does. The shop is well stocked and the food didn't seem adulterated, but the workers are overcharged. I think that's criminal, when they had little alternative but to accept this famous so-called free traders' monopoly prices. Mr. Gregg's proud to campaign against the corn laws in public on the grounds poor people suffer through higher bread prices, yet in the miniature model state of which he is sole emperor, we find he's adding another 10% to those already artificially inflated prices, despite the fact he will be purchasing them at bulk wholesale prices, or even direct from the farmer on the land next to the mill. She took her father's hand in hers. I think we need to give these and other matters the most careful consideration, father. Mr. Robert Hyde Gregg has much to teach us in his own dishonest way, but anybody who thinks he is a model employer needs to think again. It seems to me he is simply a hard-nosed, hard-faced businessman of the most selfish and greedy type. Despite the claptrap he talks about workers' welfare, he puts his own lust for profit and the accumulation of personal wealth above anything else. She looked into her father's eyes. Thank goodness you're not like that. Matthew laughed, leant over and gave his daughter an affectionate hug. Don't you think my daughter has a wonderful way with words? He asked Daniel Ackroyd, beaming with pride. Daniel smiled, nodding his agreement. Miss Rose seems to have the ability to see things that were hidden from myself, and it seems yourself, till she drew 'em to our attention, Mr. Etherell, he said. Ah, Daniel, but that's where you're wrong, the mill owner's daughter responded with a chuckle. It was your Bess who explained where I should look, what to search for, and the questions to ask, despite the fact she's never visited the place. Chapter 9. Michael O'Donnell, the union official, visited the Ackroyds' home that evening, as he'd promised. Bess and Daniel stayed up talking to him long after their normal time for bed. Small and slim, blessed with thick black hair, Michael had blue, brooding eyes. A young-looking 39-year-old, he told them he'd been born in a small village outside Belfast, to a Protestant family, although they were Irish speakers, as was the Catholic community in which they lived. He'd served an apprenticeship as a spinner in a Larne cotton mill, starting work at the age of 10. Here he'd met John Doherty, a young lad of his own age from Donegal, who previously worked in a cotton mill in his own village and subsequently one at Trim. Meeting Doherty changed his life. At the age of 18 they both moved to Manchester seeking work and obtained employment together in a mill. At this point both joined the Manchester Cotton Spinners Society, an organisation then illegal under the terms of the Combination Acts. He'd aroused Bess's interest with this information. She'd attended 2 meetings at which John Doherty had spoken, but had been unaware of his background. She asked how they'd become involved in trade unionism. Michael explained that in 1818, 1 year after their arrival, out of desperation, resulting from the spiralling cost of food, the spinners struck work for higher wages. During the turnout, John Doherty had been arrested for assault whilst picketing, a charge in fact based on fabricated evidence, as Michael testified in court. Nonetheless, the jury found John guilty, and the judge sentenced him to 2 years' hard labour in Lancaster Castle. This radicalised both men, particularly Michael, who had accompanied John throughout the dispute and knew without a doubt his friend was innocent of any assault. Michael has subsequently taken part in the meeting on St. Peter's Field in 1819, and the horrific events he witnessed that day intensified his determination to fight for radical change. He related to Bess and Daniel how, on Doherty's release from prison in 1821, he sought him out. Both participated in various political campaigns over subsequent years, in particular those for the repeal of the Combination Acts, against the new Poor Law of 1834, and for parliamentary reform. John Doherty had also been involved in efforts to repeal the Corn Laws, although Michael disagreed with him strongly on this issue. He saw it as a dispute between the landed gentry and the manufacturers, and not one the working classes should waste their energy on, convinced the repeal of the taxes on imported food would only result in a new excuse for the manufacturers to cut wages. Michael argued that whilst the Corn Laws added to the manufacturers' production costs, because they had to pay sufficient wages for their workers to subsist on, and this reduced their competitiveness internationally, once the laws were repealed, the manufacturers' prices could only be reduced as cheaper food was imported if they cut their operatives' wages by the appropriate amount. If they didn't cut wages accordingly, the mill owners unable to reduce prices would derive no benefit. All their campaigning for repeal would be of no avail to them. As profit was the end-all and be-all of capitalist endeavour, Michael remained convinced wage cuts were as inevitable as night followed day. Despite their disagreement on this issue, both men continued to work together, their friendship and their common concerns over a wide range of issues proving stronger than a temporary policy disagreement on a single issue. In any case, their differences became increasingly irrelevant, as the overwhelming majority of workers refused to support the Anti-Corn Law League anyway. Basic instinct and long experience convinced the workers the free traders Cobden and Bright and their ilk only sought their support out of their own narrow self-interest as manufacturers, and would show the workers their true colours as soon as their campaign was won, as they had in the Great Betrayal of 1832. One issue in particular united John and Michael above all others. They were appalled at the way industrialisation and the factory system had become reliant on child labour, and how it destroyed any semblance of family life. They saw this as the key challenge facing the trade union movement, and vowed to do something about it. In this regard, they of course had personal experience, both having started work at the age of 10. Accordingly, they campaigned tirelessly together to win the Manchester spinners to campaign to outlaw the practice. In 1828, Doherty initiated the formation of the Society for the Protection of Children employed in cotton factories. In the same year, he stood for election as secretary of the Manchester Spinners' Union, formed following the repeal of the Combination Acts in 1824 and 1825. Much to Michael's surprise, despite John's Irish nationality and his Catholicism, neither a natural asset in any form of popularity contest in England, even amongst the working classes, he won the election and within months faced a new challenge. The Manchester mill owners, in April 1829, began to impose wage cuts. For a workforce already living hand-to-mouth in the most abject conditions, the situation facing them was intolerable. Speedy and outright starvation threatened to replace intermittent hunger unless they took action. Doherty and most of the union delegates knew that they were in a difficult position, with few funds to support a long dispute. At the same time, they recognised the spinners had little option but to take action, withdraw their labour power and refuse reduced wages. If they didn't, the manufacturers would not only impose their wage cuts on this occasion, but, once discovering they were unopposed, would repeat the exercise time and time again. There was no room for negotiation or for alternatives, even if the mill owners had the basic courtesy to listen to their employees' plight in the first place. By imposing wage cuts, the manufacturers were in effect declaring social war. The spinners responded by declaring a turnout, which, to the mill owners' surprise and disgust, lasted 6 long months until the following October, when, with no more funds to support them and winter fast approaching, they were finally forced to return to work on the employers' terms. Blooded but unbowed, Doherty organised a national meeting of spinners which formed the Grand General Union of Operative Spinners of the United Kingdom, and shortly after organised a meeting of Manchester trade unionists. They decided to form a General Union of Trades with the purpose of providing support to fellow trade unionists involved in future industrial disputes. Doherty, steadily increasing in popularity and stature amongst all Manchester working people, both within and outside the textile trades, became editor of its publication, the United Trades Cooperative Journal, in March 1830, ensuring it communicated information, encouraged debate amongst trade unionists, and exposed the worst of the manufacturers. Appalled at this turn of events, the government, acting on behalf of the mill owners, banned the journal the following October. Doherty once again rose to the challenge, under no illusion as to how difficult it was for workers to organise in unions and to make those unions effective in the battle to defend their working conditions. Competition between the manufacturers, resulting from their determination to boost their profits and their personal wealth, and their persistent attempts to undercut each other, forced them to try to undermine any advances made by the workers and to seek cuts in wages, whilst increasing output. Thus, the laissez-faire economic system corrupted the masters as surely as it impoverished their hands, driving out any traces of human feelings and compassion, and reducing every moral question and each personal relationship between master and operative to one of cash. Inevitably, this self-same anarchic competition led to overproduction, saturated markets, and brought about periodic economic crises, resulting in even greater pressures to reduce wages, to introduce short-time working, and more often than not wholesale layoffs and mill closures, until all the unsold goods had found buyers and trade returned to normal. This in turn created and intensified competition between the workers themselves, with those out of work under pressure to accept reduced wages in order to secure jobs. For male workers, the employer's ability to use women's and children's labour wherever possible exacerbated the situation. They paid less for female labour, and, in the case of thousands of parish children, shipped from the workhouses all over Britain, enjoyed the benefit of exploiting their labour power virtually free of charge, and certainly free of wages. By 1830, there were just over 550 mills in South East Lancashire, employing 110,000 workers, of whom no less than 35,000 were children, some as young as 6 years of age. Doherty recognised the only way for workers to break this vicious cycle was to combine together and do everything possible to end the competition between themselves. Whilst all too many strikes ended in failure, at least employers were beginning to realise there was a price to be paid for their attacks on workers' living standards. Workers were also realising it was better to go down fighting like human beings than continue to be treated worse than slaves. Some, very tentatively and slowly, were learning other lessons, particularly the need to take action before things became bad and crisis took hold. In other words, to hit the manufacturers when they were at their busiest and most vulnerable to industrial action, to fight for real and substantial improvements in living and working standards, rather than to continually try and defend the status quo, to break out of the defensive mode and go on to the attack. Michael O'Donnell in particular had already reached this conclusion, but creating the conditions in which his ideas could be tested remained another matter. It would be a long time before this concept of offensive action became generally understood, and years would pass before most unions took it on board. Essentially, they were purely defensive organisations, reacting to the actions of the employers. Nonetheless, most workers knew they had to take action, even when everything seemed unwinnable. As Michael put it, if we have a choice between starving whilst working a 14-hour day, or starving whilst fighting for our children, our families and our fellow workers, I reckon we might as well choose the latter. At least we retain our dignity and assert our right to be treated as human beings, and not as a mere appendage of a manufacturer's machine, or another commodity to be bought and sold and discarded when they decide they no longer need us." He explained how Doughty helped organise the National Association for the Protection of Labour. Over 20 different trades joined the organisation within a few months. By 1831 it spread from Lancashire to the Midlands and Staffordshire, and had a membership of over 100,000 workers. Once again, Doughty's belief in the importance of communication between the trade unions and workers generally, the need to supply information, to educate and to organise, led him to a new publishing initiative. This time, in the spring of 1832, he opened a print shop and small bookstore in Manchester and published The Voice of the People. Soon the premises included a coffee house, where 96 other newspapers could be read. Again he was sent to prison as a result of complaints made by the Reverend Gilpin, a Manchester clergyman who headed a group of Christians opposed to all those arguing for democracy. He'd taken umbrage at some of the articles in Doughty's newspaper, claiming they were blasphemous. Prison only whetted Doughty's appetite for more action and strengthened his resolve. On his release he joined forces with Richard Osler and Michael Sadler, a Tory MP, in their campaign against child labour and for the 10 Hours Bill. In doing so, Doughty helped form the Manchester Short Time Committee and began publishing a new journal, The Poor Man's Advocate. Bess was more than impressed with Michael's account of John Doughty's activities, finding inspiration in the fact he could remain fighting for other people's rights after being subjected to so many setbacks. Above all, she agreed and identified with the campaign against child labour, having already resolved with Daniel that they'd do everything within their power to ensure young Daniel enjoyed his childhood and wouldn't have to start work until he was 14, if they had the power to prevent it. On the face of it, Osler was a strange bedfellow of John Doughty and Michael O'Donnell. He was a supporter of the Tory party, and his beliefs owed much to the class relationships of the pre-industrial era. He'd opposed universal suffrage and trade unions. However, he believed it was the absolute duty of the rich and privileged, and in particular those in power, to protect the weak and vulnerable, and especially their children. Bess had been at a meeting organised by Doughty in 1836, when Richard Osler, who was without doubt a powerful orator, had explained how he'd met a Bradford worsted wool mill owner, Mr. John Wood, who'd appealed to him to fight against the scourge of child labour in 1830. Pregnant with Daniel at the time, she could still remember his precise words. They'd made such an impact on her. John Wood turned towards me, Osler informed his audience. He reached out his hand and in the most impressive manner pressed my hand in his. He said, "I have had no sleep tonight. I have been reading the Bible, and in every page I have read my own condemnation. I cannot allow you to leave me without a pledge that you will use all your influence in trying to remove from our factory system the cruelties which are practised in our mills." I promised I would do what I could. I felt that we were each of us in the presence of the highest, and I knew that that vow was recorded in heaven. Osler had railed at the manufacturers and their hypocrisy, pointing out the mill owners obtained their wealth by overworking and underpaying all their workers, and by defrauding the factory children in particular, robbing them of their childhood, their innocence, their health, all too often their limbs, and on many occasions their lives. "They murder the innocents like modern Herods," he insisted. "The manufacturers are religious people, praying people, but they take great care their work people should neither have time nor strength to pray. These hypocrites pretend it's necessary to keep these poor infant slaves at this excruciating labour, just to preserve them from bad company and to prevent them learning bad habits." He'd gone on to explain how John Wood and other informants had told him, "Children are often awakened by their parents at 4 in the morning. They are pulled out of bed when almost asleep. The younger children are carried on the backs of the older children asleep to the mill, and they see no more of their parents till they go home at night and are sent to bed. and after 10 hours or so hard, dangerous labour, when they are falling asleep due to exhaustion, they are often beaten by the overseers in order to force them to complete 12 and even 14 hours work a day. Much to everybody's surprise, apart from that of John Doughty perhaps, who had spent many hours with him, Osler the Tory then urged workers to use not only strikes, but sabotage in their campaigns for the ending of child labour, enforceable factory legislation, shorter working hours, and changes in the Poor Law. His continuing advocacy of such tactics was to lead indirectly to his subsequent imprisonment in 1840, but that was in the future. At that same meeting, John Doughty, recalling a speech he'd made back in 1832 at another public event he'd addressed with Osler, pointed out, "Mr. Osler is a Tory in politics, but then we have a right to ask, will any of your boasting Liberals or professing Whigs contribute a tithe of the service which Mr. Osler has rendered to the cause of suffering humanity?" Unfortunately, men like Osler were few and far between, as Best knew only all too well. Successive parliaments had been made aware of the systematic overworking, the maiming, torturing, and in effect murder of innocents that had been a part of the factory system since its very inception. They not only knew, but also commanded the power to intervene, to regulate and prevent such excesses, but to their eternal shame they turned a blind eye. Bess had ears to hear, eyes to see and to read, and a brain to comprehend. She was all too aware, the laws spiritual in their mitres and embroidered cassocks, the laws temporal in their ermine gowns, and the law lords in their powdered wigs, all knew, each and every one of them without exception, of the terrible sufferings endured by the factory children in particular, and workers in general, as did their law-making Tory and Whig colleagues in the Commons. Best knew these self-appointed and near enough self-elected guardians of the nation discussed the need for minimal education for the children of the working classes, a discussion that always founded, ever so conveniently, on arguments between the various Christian sects and the Church of England as to which version of the Bible should be used. The Church of England insisting all children, Catholics, Jews, nonconformists and dissenters alike, should use the state-approved King James authorised version of the Scriptures and the Book of Common Prayer as the only sources of reading in schools. These debates in Parliament were no doubt interesting from a theological point of view, but Bess, like the vast majority of workers, couldn't give a toss about theology, and knew such sectarian and petty irrelevant arguments should never have been deployed in order to withhold the meagre provisions for some sort of regular education on offer. This was how the churches did their Christian duty, preventing any move towards progress for working children, and through their sectarian bickering encouraged atheism amongst their abandoned flocks, and then berated the poor for being infidels, heathens, and blasphemers. She knew how the high and mighty similarly discussed means to control the worst excesses of the manufacturers. Some wrung their hands in mock despair, while others made fine pious speeches. The followers of the self-appointed prophet Malthus blamed the poor for creating poverty, and insisted no aid be provided save the prod of the Poor Law and the fear of the workhouse treadmill. The great men of learning and privilege, in whose hands the governance of the British Empire resided, ordered investigation after investigation, amassed knowledge, facts and figures, documented outbreaks of infectious diseases, and wrote whole libraries of great reports on health, sanitation, bad housing, filthy water supplies, and industrial accidents, running into hundreds of thousands of words. They even passed factory acts limiting the hours children and women could work, the first in 1819, the second in 1825, and the third in 1831. Then, having passed their laws and done their duty to their own smug satisfaction, they turned their backs and did nothing of any use or of practical benefit, even allowing their own factory acts to remain inoperative and inoperable. Best knew how, in contrast to the vicious new Poor Law, each and every one of these acts was honoured overwhelmingly in the breach, enforcement being all too little and any punishment all too puny. Too few inspectors were employed. The majority of those inspectors weren't particularly convinced of the need for legislation in the first place, and any inspectors with serious intent had to give employers so much prior notice in writing before they paid a visit to inspect any premises. The outcome was all too obvious. In any event, the magistrates who dealt with the few cases that came before them were all manufacturers or merchants to a man. Above all, Bess knew the only people workers could rely upon for aid and assistance were, with few exceptions, working people themselves, and especially those such as Michael O'Donnell and John Doughty, just as the poorest of the poor knew the only person they could rely on for aid were also poor. Sensible beggars in London or Manchester, Birmingham or Liverpool, Glasgow or Cardiff, Dublin or Belfast were rarely seen in the commercial districts or amongst the suburbs of the rich, but in the poorest working class areas. The people who really understood the cruel tragedy of factory life had suffered it, and those who understood hunger best were those like Bess and her fellow workers who'd all been hungry. Bitter experience had taught most of the working poor in the Manchester and other industrial areas of 1838 they too could be injured or starving, or both, in the not-too-distant future. Bess had often despaired, feeling the obstacles working people faced were just too daunting. Persuading people to attend a meeting after many hours of hard soul-destroying work was an uphill task in itself, let alone expect them to risk their jobs and hence their livelihoods by taking action. The fact ordinary people like Michael O'Donnell and John Doughty could rise from the morass, educate themselves, and selflessly work for the benefit of their fellows, risking imprisonment and blacklisting by employers, provided new hope and inspiration, kindling the flames of her own determination. At the same time she realised just how important Daniel's love and support was to her, as indeed was that of Irene Rose. The mill owner's daughter provided a glorious and inspiring exception to the rule, being a traitor to her class, if ever there was one. Bess vowed not to allow herself to be weakened, or to let them, her son, or her workmates down. Chapter 10. Despite the lateness of the hour when she'd taken to her bed and finally drifted off to sleep in her husband's arms, Bess walked towards Mary Upton's with young Daniel in her arms and a spring in her step, ready to do battle and meet any challenges that came her way. Her discussions with Michael O'Donnell had not only inspired her, but together they'd resolved the outline of a plan of action to assist the workers at Nelson Mill. She'd arranged to meet Lisa Hodgkinson at lunchtime. Mary Upton had also been giving the problem facing the Nelson Mill operatives some thought. Mary's midwifery brought her into contact with individuals across the class divide. She was well aware of the nature of the enemy the workers faced. Mr. Nathaniel West was a particularly nasty example of the very worst of his class, a man who, for all his apparent grace and manners and his ever so charming wife, nonetheless engaged in sadistic and immoral acts with any member of the opposite sex he could persuade to indulge in. He was also as tight-fisted and avaricious as any devil this side of hell. Irene Rose had also risen early, eager to inform Bess of her findings at Quarrybank Mill, and to make some practical suggestions to both Bess and Mary as to other uses they could put Mary's barn to, which she believed would be of long-term and lasting benefit to the mill operatives. Thus the scene was set for further foundations to be laid upon which to build the general project Bess and Irene Rose had already agreed. By the time Bess returned to Mary Upton's to provide young Daniel with his breakfast breastfeed, Irene Rose sat at the kitchen table, sharing a pot of tea with the midwives Charlotte and Clara. She greeted the spinner warmly and poured her a cup of tea. "How did the visit to Cheshire go?" Bess asked. Irene Rose laughed. "Hasn't Daniel told you? We were entertaining Michael O'Donnell till late, and Daniel were falling asleep afore I got him to bed. Well, Bess, our visit went exactly as you predicted. They tried to pull the wool over our eyes, but thanks to you, they never stood a chance. I managed to break away from the official tour and discovered the truth, or at least sufficient of it. Once I explained to Father how Greg's man had tried to dupe us, he was furious. I reckon Robert I. Greg's got a lot of explaining to do next time my father meets him." She glanced at Bess. "Who's Michael O'Donnell?" Bess smiled. "A most amazing, cultured and handsome Irishman, an official of our union and a Chartist to boot." All the women suddenly looked alert. "He sounds interesting," Irene Rose replied quietly. "You'll maybe get to meet him soon, Rose. He plays fiddle and sings, and he's offered to organise a music session for us, free of charge, if we use it to raise money for the Nelson Mill workers." "Why do they need money, Bess?" "'Cause they may be organising a turnout sooner than later," Charlotte informed her. "A turnout? They need to be careful getting into a fight with Nathaniel West," Irene Rose informed them. "He's an arrogant young man who thinks he's God's gift." "That's an understatement, if e'er I heard one," Mary Upton responded, shaking her head. "I thinks we can handle him, providing we unite the Nelson Mill operatives and raise sufficient funds to sustain them," Bess replied. "West will do anything to defeat a turnout," Irene Rose warned. "He'll bring in knobsticks without a moment's hesitation." "Without that, we plans to make the mill inoperable," Bess responded mysteriously. "I needs to speak to Lisa in the lunch break." "I've been thinking how I can help," Mary said. "If worse happens, we could convert barn into an eating house and provide victuals cheap. Operatives will need feeding, won't they? It's hard for folks to fight on empty bellies." "We'll need outside help and funds," Irene Rose pointed out, eager to be involved. "Maybe I can involve some of my friends from the Chorlton-upon-Medlock branch of the Women Chartists." "We've time to make arrangements yet," Bess assured them. "First job's to organise women and the men into the union. We mustna run afore we can walk." Once the three spinners had returned to the mill, Irene Rose broached the subject of using the barn to provide food for the Nelson Mill operatives. Mary informed her she hadn't really thought it through. It was a suggestion she'd made on the spur of the moment. "Nonetheless, it's a good suggestion," Irene Rose pointed out. "But I think, if you're willing to allow the barn to be used, we should think of something more permanent." "Well, the barn's gone into waste, and I reckon we should put it to good use," Mary responded. She poured herself a cup of tea and passed the pot over to Irene Rose. "What are you thinking, Rose?" "I'm thinking it would be nice to have a tea shop, somewhere open to all the mill workers, where they can obtain refreshment and decent basic food, either to eat here or to take away with them. It would need to be open during their meal breaks. We could call it Mary's Kitchen." "We'd need money to get it off the ground, Rose." "I've been thinking of that. Let's see if you think this makes sense to you." Mary Upton listened patiently and with increasing interest as Irene Rose explained her ideas. "There you are, Rose. I thought you'd have been down at Mary Upton's to see Bess and her friends. It's almost 1 o'clock. Irene Rose shook her head. "No, not today, Father. I'll be going later." Matthew looked at his daughter. She was studying a pamphlet. She sounded serious and slightly preoccupied. "Is something worrying you, love?" She glanced up at him, pushing the pamphlet away from her and smiling. "No, Father, just thinking. I'm working on a new project." He sat down opposite her. "Would you like to tell me about it?" "I'm not sure where to begin," she said quietly. "Well, Rose, why not try starting at the beginning?" "That's it, Father. I don't know the beginning." She shook her head and smiled at him. "I'm being silly. It's about nutrition. We all need food. Without it we can't live. Those who work hardest need more energy than those that don't, so they need more food. Yet those who work hardest in our society get the poorest quality food, and they don't get anywhere near enough." Matthew nodded and waited patiently whilst Rose gathered her thoughts. "What day do you pay your workers their wages?" "On a Saturday," the mill owner responded. "It's traditional. Everybody gets paid on a Saturday." "Yes, Father. That's one of the reasons why they end up with the worst food. By the time they're able to do their shopping, all the best food has gone. The middle classes always have money, and most shop on a Saturday. By the time the workers get to the shops after they've finished work, everything decent's sold. They're left with the rubbish, and on a Sunday all the shops are closed. I must admit it never crossed my mind, Rose. Why should it? You were never good at shopping, were you, father? No, he said, shaking his head. I never was, Rose. Well, I hadn't thought about it either, Rose admitted. But then I didn't have any friends who were mill workers before. She looked at her father for a moment, wondering if the time was right to put her proposition to him. Father, could you loan me £50? I wish to invest in a business enterprise. I think I can afford to pay you the sum back over 2 years and pay interest at 5%. Compound interest, 5% a month? No, father, simple interest, 5% a year. Matthew grinned and then frowned. You won't get a loan on that basis at a bank. Irene Rose laughed. But whenever I ask you to buy me a new bonnet or a pair of fashionable boots, you always tell me you're not a bank, don't you? Matthew gazed into his daughter's eyes. I think you should tell me exactly what this business enterprise is all about, he said quietly. Irene Rose's proposition had the advantage of simplicity. Through her contacts with Bess, she discovered the typical mill worker's diet consisted of a cup of tea and a piece of bread for breakfast. The tea was usually weak and of poor quality, and often adulterated. They added milk sparingly, if at all. The higher paid workers, and those careful with their diet, had oatmeal porridge instead of bread. The lunchtime meal, the main meal, usually consisted of boiled potatoes drained and placed in a bowl. Over these, a sauce of melted lard and butter was poured, and when it could be afforded, which wasn't often, a few scraps of fried bacon added, they all being mixed together. Fresh meat was seldom used, being regarded as a great luxury, and, for most, unaffordable. For many, the evening meal was the same as breakfast, although the better-off workers would indulge themselves with a repeat of the lunchtime meal. Mary Upton and she had discussed the matter previously, and between the two of them, they'd ensured the women whose children Mary cared for were provided with decent food. Now, Irene Rose wanted to take this a step further and ensure good simple food was available at affordable prices in the area of her father's mill for any operatives who wished to take advantage. The barn was large and could cater for at least 70 people seated, and the yard could take many more when the weather was suitable and, if needs be, could be covered to provide more shelter. If the place was full, they could supply food for people to consume at their workplace. Furthermore, as demand increased, the aim would be to not only provide cooked food, but also to sell cheap cuts of fresh meat and vegetables, bacon, cheese, eggs and milk. There were plenty of farmers still left in the surrounding areas who would no doubt be pleased to supply them. The two main problems were to raise capital to get the project off the ground and find suitable people to carry out the preparation and serving of the food, the latter being less of a problem than the former. Mary's kitchen was available for the cooking. Irene Rose knew there'd be no shortage of demand. Workers had little time to shop. More often than not, the food available tended to be of poor quality and often adulterated. The adding of chalk or gypsum to flour was commonplace, as was the practice of pasting fresh butter on the outside of a block of old rank butter. In fact, virtually all foodstuffs could be tainted in some way, and most dealers and traders thought ripping off the poor was perfectly acceptable. Once she'd put her initial ideas to Mary, they'd refined them to the point where Irene Rose had been confident to speak to her father about them. In turn, he'd made suggestions, and they'd finalised a package of proposals to put to the test of a wider discussion. The basic idea was to form a Producers' Mutual Benefit Society, an employee-controlled cooperative. The enterprise would consist of all those employed in the tea room and shop, and no others. Each employee would purchase a £1 share, and each would be able to vote and participate in the enterprise's business decisions. Only employees could be members, and each member could only hold 1 share. Anybody who took employment with the co-op, who couldn't afford to purchase a £1 share, would be loaned the money and an agreed amount deducted from their wages each week, interest-free. At the end of the financial year, each would receive a share of any surplus made, in the form of a dividend, based on the number of hours worked, although a minimum of 35% of any surplus had to be invested back into the business to ensure sufficient capital was available to sustain and grow the enterprise. This amount for reinvestment could be increased, but not reduced below the 35%, as the co-op members felt fit. Regular customers of the business would have the opportunity to become members of a consumer co-op, which the producer co-op would supply with foodstuffs, both benefiting from bulk buying. All goods would be guaranteed to be of high quality, free of adulteration, and a fair price charged, either equal to or less than comparable retail prices. At the end of each year, members of the consumer co-op would be entitled to a dividend of 2% minimum on their total expenditure over the previous year. This amount would be subject to review each year by an annual general meeting of all members. Matthew had assured his daughter he provided with the initial capital she required, and indicated if required more would be made available, providing the enterprise's books were subject to independent and regular scrutiny by a minimum of 2 auditors. He also offered to make Daniel Ackroyd available to organise and oversee any construction work necessary. This agreed, Irene Rose set to work, drawing up detailed proposals to put before Mary, Bess, Clara and Charlotte for their comments and advice. Chapter 11. Bess Ackroyd stretched out her arm as she awoke, and realised Daniel wasn't in bed. The empty space beside her was still warm. She turned over, wondering why he was up so early on a Sunday morning, and then smiled as she heard his footsteps on the bare boards of the steep, narrow stairs. He pushed open the bedroom door, 2 cups of steaming tea in his hand. "Happy birthday," he said with a grin, as he sat down gingerly on the side of the bed. Bess struggled upright and stroked his cheek for a moment. He'd had a shave. She took the cup of tea held out to her, smiling like a Cheshire cat. "Thanks, Daniel. I was sure they'd forgot." He laughed. He'd only remembered on the previous Thursday because somebody had mentioned it was their daughter's birthday, but that had provided time to make some arrangements. "Is our Daniel awake?" "No, the lad's still asleep. I'll no disturb him till thy tea's drunk, Bess." "Aren't they hungry? I'll best be making breakfast." "Nay, lass, we'll go to Mary's kitchen later. My treat." "Mary won't be opening today. It's Sunday." "She's opening at 11. Nelson Milk Committee are meeting and have booked a meal, evidently." "Are they sure? They said nowt to me." "Aye, I'm sure. But if I'm wrong, we'd have had enjoyed what? It's a crisp day out yonder." He smiled and kissed her on the nose. "Get ready, Bess. Best not waste good weather. Your Sunday best is on the bed end waiting for me." "Pass o'er our Daniel first. I'll feed him." She placed a cup down as Daniel went to retrieve the lad from his basket, resting on a low chest at the bottom of the bed. Bess and Daniel walked down Loom Street towards the canal. The air was sharp, but the sky remained comparatively clear for Manchester, and a wintry sun did its best to brighten their surroundings and lighten their hearts. Young Daniel, held in the crook of his father's arm, snaked his left arm around his father's neck. They turned into Union Street, crossing over the road onto the narrow pavement, separated from the canal by a low wall. Young people, mainly unmarried girls in small groups of 4 or 5, ranging from 12 to 20 years old, walked along the canal towpath, arm in arm, obviously enjoying the unseasonable sunshine. All, like Bess, wore the regulation long shawl around their shoulders, which would cover their head as well as their shoulders later, and be fastened under the chin to protect them from the cold. Most wore white dresses, finishing just above the ankles, over cotton petticoats, although the few able to afford it preferred flannel, which was warmer. The feet of all, save the very poorest, were shod with Sunday best clogs polished to perfection. Small groups of boys and young men sat on walls trying to gain their attention, as young males tend to do, but the girls more often than not remained aloof, ignoring their flirtatious comments, banter and entreaties. They could afford to. The majority of the older ones were spinners, and therefore amongst the highest paid workers in the area. They could pick and choose, and the males had little alternative, save hoping they might drop lucky and find themselves to be the chosen one. There were many families now where the women were the main breadwinners, and all too many men sat at home darning socks. Males were no longer cock of the walk in the cotton districts. The mill girls knew it and were not backward in taking advantage. The Ackroyds walked into Mary Upton's yard, which had undergone a transformation with Daniel's help. The ivy-clad cottage remained the same, but a large timber-framed awning running the full length of the barn extended over the cobbled yard. A large brightly painted sign bore the message "Mary's Kitchen," with the information "Produce a Cooperative Enterprise" depicted in smaller letters underneath. Beneath its shelter about 12 tables with 4 or 5 chairs around each were scattered at intervals. Couples with young families occupied most, and 2 great braziers full of glowing coals helped keep the cold at bay. The large high doors of the barn were wide open, and the inside illuminated with small gas lamps set along the clean white walls, which had been freshly lime-washed. A doorway not through the end wall shared with the cottage provided access to the kitchen, and a small counter stood before it. Behind this 2 girls, one about 12, Susan Openshaw by name, and the other, Esther Radcliffe, aged 14, awaited customers. Each sported a smart, starched white apron complete with bib and tied around the waist. Young Amy Redbank and Anna Sutcliffe had also sought employment with the court, and much to their delight had been accepted. They were busy in the kitchen, working under the direction of Mary Upton, who had been elected manager, head cook and bottle washer. Like the outside covered area, tables were scattered, seemingly haphazardly, throughout the room, although this was misleading, as the arrangement made access to each table easy for those serving food. On the right-hand end of the long space stood a raised platform 2 feet above the gritstone flag floor, providing a stage. People standing filled the entrance, and as Bess, Daniel and the baby approached, they turned towards them, smiled and wished them good morning. Most were Gibraltar or Nelson Mill employees. They parted, and Irene Rose appeared, accompanied by Lisa Hodgkinson. The mill owner's daughter extended her hand out to Bess. "Happy birthday, love," Irene Rose and Lisa said in perfect unison. Daniel stopped in his tracks, a big grin on his face, pleased his hitherto secret arrangements for Bess's special day were proceeding to his satisfaction. Taken by surprise, Bess looked back at him over her shoulder for a brief moment, pulling her face as Irene Rose guided her to a large table placed parallel with the back wall of the barn. She pulled out a seat for Bess and sat her down, taking a seat on one side of her, whilst Lisa sat next to her on the other. At that point, a fiddle began to play, and everyone began to sing the birthday song. That done, those present clapped and cheered, and soon women bearing plates of food and jugs of fresh milk appeared. Daniel, accompanied by a gang of Bess's workmates, including Charlotte and Clara and their children, took his seat at the table. Young Daniel sat in pride of place on his father's knee, enjoying being made a fuss of, as was his right. Lisa informed Bess it was a double celebration. Every single woman and girl who worked at Nelson Mill had now joined the union, as had most of the men. Her own husband was already a member of his own craft union, he being the mill's steam engine operative and millwright. The cotton operatives had elected a committee and instructed it to draw up a new petition to place before the mill superintendent. They'd just finished their deliberations. Their demands were simple, concise and reasonable. Moreover, they'd not prove costly to the company if met. The workers wanted all moving belts with buckles replaced and all moving belts to be fitted with guards in situations where workers could make contact with them. The work to be completed within 1 month. They were aware it would be cheap to replace the belts, because once the buckles were removed, the leather could still be used. It merely requires stitching, a process easily completed on the premises without hiring specialist labour. They also requested a safety committee be appointed, composed of workers and overseers, to examine further safety measures that might be necessary. If granted, no action would be taken, but if rejected, the workers would walk out of the mill immediately, hold a meeting there and then, and determine future action. Bess asked when they intended to present the petition. Lisa informed the 3 women, of whom she was one, would beard the superintendent, Jacob Kennedy, in his office as soon as he arrived on the premises the next day. Evidently, he usually appeared just before the break for breakfast at 8. Liza told her the time was ripe. They'd discovered the firm had just received a large export order and were advertising for new hands on their notice boards outside the mill.